So the relationship between fathers and sons, those relationships are not always harmonious. Sometimes they're so dominated by conflict that a son decides the only possible option is to leave, is to move out. This past summer in the San Francisco Globe, there was published this fictional story. A father passed by his son's room and was astonished to discover the bed had been freshly made and everything was picked up off of the floor and put away. And then the father noticed that there was an envelope propped up prominently on the pillow. With the worst premonition and with trembling hands, the father went into his son's room. He opened the envelope and he read this letter. Dear Dad, it is with great regret and sorrow that I'm writing. I had to elope with my new girlfriend because I wanted to avoid a scene with you and Mom. I've been finding real passion with Stacy and she is just so nice. However, I knew you wouldn't approve of her because of her piercings, tattoos, and tight motorcycle clothes. Also, she's quite a bit older than me. And it's not only the passion, Dad, she's pregnant. Stacy says we'll be very happy together. She owns a trailer in the woods and has a stack of firewood for the whole winter. We share a dream of having many more children. Stacy has opened my eyes to the fact that marijuana doesn't really hurt anyone. We'll be growing it ourselves and trading it with other people in the commune for all the cocaine and ecstasy we want. In the meantime, we'll pray that science will find a cure for AIDS so Stacy can get better. She sure deserves it. And don't worry, Dad, I'm 15 and I know how to take care of myself. Someday I'm sure we'll be back to visit and you can get to know all of your grandchildren. Love, Joshua. And then the PS says, Dad, none of the above is true. I'm over at Jason's house. I just wanted to remind you that there are worse things in life than the school report that's on the kitchen table. Call me when it's safe to come home. So the fact that the relationship between fathers and sons might sometimes include a little stress or disagreement, well, that's not new. That's where our biblical story actually begins. Jesus had been telling a large crowd, teaching a large crowd, a number of lessons by telling them parables, stories with surprising twists and turns to them. And this story begins with a part of it that would have just been shocking to anybody in that first century crowd. That opening scene would have been troubling to people in that first century crowd. Jesus doesn't explain, doesn't offer any background to how this story begins, but he simply says that a young man, a younger son, approaches his father and says, I want out. I want my money, and I just want out. Now, in first century Judaism, the laws mandating the distribution of property from one generation to the next, from father to son, it was strictly mandated. The older son received the most, double what anyone else would get. But that distribution of property from generation to generation, it only happened, except in extremely rare cases, it only happened when the father was deceased, when the father was died. And so this younger son has the audacity to basically go up to his father and say, I can't wait for you to die. I want out now. I want my money. I want my third of your property. I just, as if you're already dead. Just give me what I want. Let me out. Give me my freedom. If we had been in that first century crowd, we would have been so shocked by that disrespect. That was totally unheard of in first century Judaism for a younger son to be that disrespectful of his father. And yet Jesus says, the father responds in a really surprising way, another twist in the parable. It's as if the father senses that what this son really needs is his freedom. What this son requires is that money and that freedom to go out. And so that boy is given what he wants, his freedom, his money. He goes out and he walks away to a distant land. So imagine we're in that first century crowd. We'd be muttering to ourselves, that boy doesn't deserve his inheritance. He doesn't deserve his freedom. What he deserves is a strict and harsh lesson in respect and in what is right and wrong. And yet, from our vantage point here in the distant future, that argument between father and son isn't really that shocking, is it? It almost seems normal. Because since Jesus' day, there has been a great deal of study about how faith grows. And any number of scholars, any number of psychologists suggest that faith moves, that faith journeys through a number of stages of development as it grows. And one of those first stages is called affiliation. That's when children accept the faith of the authorities in their lives, just accept what they're being taught by parents and church school teachers. But there comes a point when children or young adults or adults begin to question that faith that they've inherited. They start to look at other faiths and beliefs and traditions. They push on the boundaries of what they've always known, push and move out and beyond so that they can begin to make the faith their own. Steve Jones, in his book Faith Shaping, says that's a stage called personalizing faith. It's asking, discovering, looking, and then coming up, developing our own convictions, our own sense of who we are and what we truly believe. So maybe that's at least part of what was going on with that younger son. He wanted to push a little bit, move out a little bit, so that he could develop his own sense of who he was, develop his own sense of his convictions and what he truly believed. It's a crucial stage for everyone as we move through this journey of faith. Now, one of the books that I read on sabbatical this summer was called The Children Act. It was written by Ian McEwan. And the central character in this book is Fiona May, who is a high court judge in England, and she oversees cases related to family law. And she is presented with a very interesting case. It is about a 17-year-old boy named Adam Henry who is suffering from leukemia, but he is refusing part of the treatment that the doctor and the hospital wants to provide him. The standard protocol of treatment involves 4 cancer drugs and blood transfusion. 2 of the cancer drugs not only fight the cancer, but also compromise the body's immune system, compromising its ability to make white and red blood cells and platelets. But Adam Henry is a Jehovah's Witness, and one of the interesting characteristics of that particular faith has to do with blood. And as the book explains, Jehovah's Witnesses understand blood to be the essence of life. It is sacred, a true gift from God, and the blood from one person is never to be mixed with the blood from another person or another animal. And if that mixture happens, it's contaminated, it's pollution, and to create that mixture is an unforgivable sin. And so Judge May, in her courtroom, hears arguments for the hospital who desperately want to save this boy. They've given him the cancer drugs. He is sick, and they know the blood transfusion will help make him well again. But she also hears arguments on the behalf of the family who really want to have their beliefs and traditions respected. And she also hears that Adam, who is just shy of being 18 years old when he would be able to make his own legal health decisions, she hears he's very articulate, very bright. And so she decides to go to the hospital to talk with Adam herself. And so on an afternoon, she walks into this darkened hospital room, and she sees this boy lying in bed, and he's clearly very sick. But they engage in a lively conversation about music, about school, about things he's learned, and about his beliefs. And as she leaves the hospital room, she says, Adam, that she is impressed with how well he's been able to articulate the faith in which he has been raised. So Adam is shocked when later he discovers that the judge ruled against his wishes, thus allowing the hospital to give him a blood transfusion. But in her decision, Judge May writes that she believed that Adam had had an uninterrupted monochrome of exposure to a forceful view of the world, but that he had never been exposed to anything else. And so, yes, he could very well parrot. He had memorized. He knew the faith in which he had been raised, but she wasn't convinced that it was his own. And she simply could not allow him to perish unless she was certain that faith was his own. Clearly, that younger son in our story, he could have left home more politely, perhaps less rudely, less brashly. And yet, maybe there really is something good about that choice to go and to push, because it's an important stage for all of us, whether we're 17, 70, 100, to ask, to think, to explore, and to make sure what we think and believe is truly our own, that we've sorted it out, that we've hammered out our own convictions. But then while that young man is out there, life in that distant world, it doesn't go so well for him. He makes one bad choice, it seems, after another. He just actually seems to party all the time. He just parties and he parties until he has absolutely nothing left. He has no food, he has no place to live, he has no friends. He just constantly made bad choices, chose to walk an unhealthy and an unhelpful path. He is alone. Not even the people that he partied with seem to be available to him to help him at this point. No one will even allow him food. He breaks another sacred tradition of his faith, and he starts to feed pigs. He is utterly alone, having made these bad choices. Henry Nouwen has written a book called The Return of the Prodigal Son, a journey of homecoming. And in it, he describes the despair that this prodigal son is feeling. He says that that younger son became fully aware of just how lost he was when no one in his surroundings showed any interest in him at all. They wouldn't even give to him to eat what he was giving to the pigs to eat. He realized that people weren't even seeing him. They weren't even recognizing him as a human being. And he felt the profundity of his isolation. He felt the loneliest experience a human being can experience. He was completely and utterly alone and in despair. While he was out there in that distant land, that young man kept making every possible choice he could that did not promote life, that promoted hunger, being without shelter, and being totally alone. And when he realized that, our gospel writer Luke says, then he came to himself. Or Nouwen expresses it as, then he had the deepest sense of himself, that he recognized he is a human being, a relational being. That is who we are at the core, isn't it? As human beings, we're relational. We don't just, somehow materialize here on earth. We are sons, we're daughters. We're fathers and mothers, cousins, aunts, uncles, friends, co-workers, part of a church community. We are built to relate to others and to God. And so it's at that moment that that younger son decides he made some mistakes. And it was time to go back and to admit that and go back to his family, to the people who cared for him, and hope that they will receive him, if not as a son, at least as a hired hand. He admitted his mistakes, and he heads for home. He admitted his mistakes. Doesn't that sound easy? And yet, honestly, isn't it true that so many of us, so many people have a hard time admitting mistakes? Just simply saying to someone else, you know what? I made a mistake and I'm sorry. What can we do to rebuild this relationship? How many relationships remain shattered, crushed before us because we can't say those simple words, I'm sorry. What can we do to heal this? There's another book I read on my sabbatical called In the Woods, and it's in Ireland, and it's about two detectives, Cassie and Rob, who are involved in trying to solve two crimes at the same time. One is a cold case of a couple of missing children from years before, and the other is a current murder, something that has just happened. And they sense that somehow these two crimes are connected. So Rob and Cassie end up spending a lot of time together, and they become very, very good friends. As partners, they have each other's back. But then after spending so many hours together, one evening the relationship moves from friendship to a romantic one. And the next morning, Rob realizes that he just can't handle it, that he's made a mistake. But rather than approach Cassie and talk to her about it, he just distances himself, removes himself. Cassie keeps trying to have that conversation and say, we can be friends, we can work this out. But he won't do it, and the relationship just stays there, shattered. They're never able to mend it. In a magazine called Entrepreneur, Steve Blank talks about his life as the vice president of marketing of a firm called Supermac. And he talks about how, as that vice president, whenever he made a mistake, he had one strategy, and that was to blame somebody else. That's what he always did. The only variable was who in the company he might blame. And so one time he had created this $150,000 marketing strategy that resulted in no revenue for the company at all. It was a pretty big disaster. And so he was going to a staff meeting where he knew this was going to be the discussion. So he was trying to figure out who he was going to blame the mistake on. And so he decided to blame it on one of the sales guys that he had a fairly adversarial relationship with, because then he knew that the argument that they had would be so fierce that people would forget about the mistake he'd made. So staff meeting went on, and it came to the point where it was time to talk about this marketing strategy. And Steve stood up and he said, you know what? I made a mistake. I don't know how to fix it. I need everybody's help. The room was utterly quiet until someone finally stammered, what did you say? But it was a turning point, not just for that staff meeting. It was a turning point for that company. People could say, I can't do it all by myself. Sometimes I make mistakes. Can I have your ideas? And they started to work together and build on their ideas. So we have a son, a younger son, little brash, a little rude, but who pushes those boundaries and says, I need some space to figure out who I am and to hammer out my own convictions. A son who was able, after making some bad choices, to admit that and to return home in the hope of reestablishing relationships. And when he got home, that father, oh, I can't go there, that's for next week.